There are moments in history when the noise of the world grows so loud that silence itself feels suspicious, when the soul senses that something essential has been misplaced, not stolen in a single dramatic robbery, but slowly exchanged coin by coin, compromise by compromise, until one wakes to discover that what was once sacred has been priced, packaged, and sold. We are living in such a moment, a time of great spiritual apathy, not because people have stopped believing altogether, but because belief has been reduced to a slogan, a badge, or worse, a transaction. We speak of faith while negotiating its return. We pray, yet keep one eye on the ledger. And in that divided gaze, something quietly withers. Scripture speaks with unnerving clarity into this condition. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against forces unseen, currents of thought, patterns of desire, structures of temptation that move through history like dark rivers beneath the surface of polite society. Yet it would be a grave mistake to imagine these forces only as external enemies, wearing secret uniforms and holding clandestine meetings in candlelit rooms. That is far too easy and far too comforting. For if the darkness were only out there, then the heart could remain unexamined, unrepentant, and unchanged. The more dangerous truth, the one that unsettles rather than entertains, is that these forces operate first as invitations within the human soul. When we speak, then, of 5 dark secret orders, let us understand them as ancient patterns of corruption that recur wherever faith forgets its purpose and wealth forgets its place. They are not primarily organizations one can point to with an accusing finger, but postures of the heart that infiltrate churches, families, and individual lives with astonishing ease. They serve no master so openly as greed, pride, fear, and the subtle belief that power can save what character cannot. The first of these orders is the order of replacement, the quiet conviction that money can do what meaning once did. It begins innocently enough, as most corruptions do, a desire for stability, a concern for provision, a wish to be responsible. But slowly, the means becomes the end. Wealth, once a tool, becomes a testimony. Success, once a byproduct, becomes a sacrament. We begin to measure blessing by abundance rather than by obedience, by comfort rather than by courage. The church adopts the language of the marketplace, speaking of growth without asking what precisely is growing. And in that moment, Mammon does not need to storm the sanctuary. He is invited to sit quietly in the front row. The second order is the order of appearance, which values influence over integrity. This order teaches that being seen matters more than being true, that platforms are holier than practices, that numbers are more convincing than names. Under its rule, leaders learn to curate rather than to confess, to perform righteousness instead of pursuing it. The soul becomes a brand, the sermon a product, and repentance an inconvenience best handled in private if at all. Here deception does not arrive dressed as evil. It arrives dressed as excellence, efficiency, and relevance. Yet relevance without righteousness is merely fashion, and fashion, as history repeatedly shows, is a poor substitute for truth. The third order is the order of control, which mistakes certainty for faith and dominance for authority. It thrives wherever fear is baptized, as discernment and suspicion masquerades as wisdom. This order cannot tolerate mystery, for mystery requires humility, and humility cannot be controlled. So it builds rigid systems, draws sharp lines, and declares itself the guardian of purity. But the irony is cruel. In attempting to protect faith from contamination, it contaminates faith with arrogance. The gospel becomes a weapon rather than a wound, something used to conquer rather than to heal. And souls, sensing the absence of grace, quietly slip away not because they hate God, but because they cannot breathe in rooms where love has been replaced by leverage. The fourth order is the order of transaction, which reduces spiritual life to a series of bargains. If I give, I will get. If I obey, I will be rewarded. If I suffer, I must have failed. This order is particularly seductive because it borrows the language of faith while hollowing out its core. It speaks of sowing and reaping, but forgets that some seeds grow underground for years before breaking the surface. It promises prosperity, but has no category for the cross. Under its influence, gratitude is offered only when circumstances comply, and prayer becomes a technique rather than a relationship. God is subtly recast as a cosmic accountant, and when the numbers do not add up, disillusionment follows close behind. The fifth and most insidious order is the order of forgetfulness, the gradual loss of memory regarding what faith is for, not to make us impressive, but to make us whole, not to shield us from suffering, but to teach us how to endure it without becoming cruel, not to elevate us above others, but to bind us to them in responsibility and compassion. This order does not attack belief directly, it simply distracts it. It fills calendars, inflates programs, multiplies commitments, until the quiet work of transformation is crowded out. People remain busy in the name of God while becoming strangers to Him in practice. Now, it would be easy at this point to surrender to fear, to imagine oneself besieged by invisible enemies with no hope of resistance. But fear, too, is a poor counselor. The deeper, steadier truth is this: the battle is not one we are anxiously trying to win. It is one whose outcome has already been decided. Victory, in the Christian vision, is not achieved through domination, but through transformation. It does not arrive with spectacle, but with surrender. One does not fight from desperation, but from assurance. To put on the full armor of God, then, is not to adopt a posture of paranoia, scanning every shadow for conspiracies. It is to cultivate discernment without cynicism, courage without cruelty, and conviction without contempt. It is to remember that spiritual authority flows not from secret knowledge or dramatic gestures, but from a life slowly, stubbornly aligned with truth. Curses are broken not by shouting at darkness, but by turning on the light. Deception loses its power when honesty becomes habitual. Greed loosens its grip when gratitude is practiced daily, not as a feeling, but as a discipline. This is where wealth must be reconsidered, not as an enemy, but as a test. Money, like fire, is a useful servant and a terrible master. It reveals what we already love. If meaning governs the heart, wealth can become a means of generosity, creativity, and service. If emptiness governs the heart, no amount of money will ever be enough, and every increase will only sharpen the appetite. The question, then, is not how much one has, but what one believes money is for. Does it exist to insulate us from need, or to equip us to meet it in others? Does it promise security, or does it demand trust? Inner transformation is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with thunder. More often, it unfolds in small, unremarkable choices. Telling the truth when a lie would be convenient. Giving when saving would feel safer. Forgiving when resentment seems justified. Resting when productivity insists on one more hour. Moral strength is built in these moments, not as a performance, but as a habit. And habits, over time, shape destiny more reliably than any secret plan ever could. We are tempted, in anxious times, to look for villains because villains simplify the story. They give us someone to blame and somewhere to point. But the gospel tells a more demanding story, one in which the line between light and darkness runs not between institutions, but through every human heart. That is not an accusation. It is an invitation to vigilance without hysteria, to seriousness without despair, to hope grounded not in our own strength, but in a victory already secured. So do not be afraid, not because there is nothing to fear, but because fear is no longer in charge. You are not called to panic, but to practice faithfulness, not to expose others obsessively, but to examine yourself honestly, not to fight for victory, but to live from it, to embody in ordinary days and difficult decisions the quiet rebellion of a life that refuses to let money replace meaning, power replace love, or appearance replace truth. And when enough lives are lived that way, something remarkable happens. The invisible forces that thrive on apathy begin to starve. The so-called orders lose their influence, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. For darkness cannot organize against a people who have learned to see, to give, to forgive, and to hope without guarantees. In such lives, abundance is no longer measured by what is accumulated, but by what is shared. Faith is no longer defended as an ideology, but expressed as a way of being. And the soul, finally awake, remembers why it was created in the first place, not to conquer the world, but to love it without being owned by it. And once the soul remembers this, it becomes strangely unmanageable by the systems that once fed upon its confusion. A person who knows why they live cannot easily be bought. A heart that has tasted meaning will not be endlessly distracted by substitutes. This is why true spiritual awakening has always frightened the powers of every age, not because awakened people are loud or violent, but because they are free. They cannot be coerced by fear, nor seduced by excess, nor silenced by shame. They move through the world with an unsettling calm, as though they know something others have forgotten. This calm is not naivete. It is not ignorance of darkness. It is clarity. It is the steady awareness that evil does not win by strength alone, but by exhaustion, by persuading good people that resistance is futile, that integrity is impractical, that hope is childish. Yet history, read honestly, tells a different story. Every age of decay has been met by men and women who refused to trade their souls for survival. They did not always succeed by worldly standards. Some lost status, some lost comfort, some lost everything except their conscience. And yet it is their names, not the names of the manipulators and hoarders, that echo through time. Here lies a hard truth modern culture avoids. Suffering does not automatically corrupt the soul. What corrupts the soul is suffering without meaning. When pain is endured for nothing, it curdles into bitterness. When it is endured for love, for truth, for something larger than the self, it deepens the soul rather than diminishing it. This is why any spiritual system that promises comfort without character is not merely mistaken, but dangerous. It robs people of the very thing they will need when comfort inevitably fails them. Wealth, then, must be placed back into its proper narrative, not as salvation, not as proof of virtue, but as responsibility. Money amplifies what is already there. In the hands of the fearful, it multiplies anxiety. In the hands of the vain, it multiplies emptiness. In the hands of the generous, it multiplies life. The moral question is never how much you possess, but how much of you your possessions possess in return. If your peace rises and falls with your bank balance, then your balance is no longer a number, it is a master. This is why gratitude is not a polite accessory to faith, but one of its core disciplines. Gratitude trains the eye to see reality rather than fantasy. It anchors joy in what is given rather than what is imagined. Without gratitude, desire becomes infinite and cruel. With it, even modest provision can feel abundant. Gratitude does not deny ambition. It purifies it. It asks not only what do I want, but why do I want it, and what will it make of me if I get it? The great deception of our time is not that evil disguises itself as good, but that it disguises itself as necessary. Necessary to keep up, necessary to stay relevant, necessary to remain secure. And slowly, under the banner of necessity, people permit what they would once have rejected. They bend where they once stood. They excuse what they once confronted, not because they are wicked, but because they are tired. Spiritual apathy is rarely born of rebellion. It is born of weariness. And yet, weariness is not the end of the story. Rest is not the shallow rest of distraction, but the deep rest of alignment, the rest that comes when one's inner life is no longer at war with one's outer pursuits. When what you believe, what you say, and what you do begin, however imperfectly, to converge. This rest is fiercely resisted by every dark current in the world, because it produces people who are no longer frantic consumers of meaning, but quiet carriers of it. Such people do not need secret knowledge to stand firm. They do not need to obsess over hidden enemies. They are too occupied with the visible work of loving well, working honestly, and living courageously. They understand that the most effective resistance to corruption is not outrage, but example. Not exposure alone, but embodiment. A life rightly ordered becomes a kind of exorcism, driving out falsehood simply by refusing to cooperate with it. This is what it means to fight from victory rather than for it. To act not out of panic, but out of confidence. To know that no shadow, however ancient, can withstand sustained light. To trust that truth, once lived rather than merely spoken, possesses a quiet authority no oath or ritual can counterfeit. Darkness depends on confusion. Light depends only on presence. And so the call before us is not dramatic, but demanding. To think clearly in an age of manipulation, to give generously in an age of hoarding, to remain gentle in an age of outrage, to pursue excellence without worshipping success, to handle wealth without letting it handle you, to hold faith not as a weapon against others, but as a compass for oneself. For when enough individuals choose this path, when they refuse to let money replace meaning, fear replace wisdom, or power replace love, the so-called secret orders lose their mystique. They are revealed not as omnipotent forces, but as parasites that thrive only where purpose has collapsed. And purpose, once reclaimed, is astonishingly resilient. In that reclamation, something awakens, not a frenzy, not a crusade, but a steady courage. A sense that life, however difficult, is charged with significance. That every honest choice pushes back the dark a little further. That the world is not saved in grand gestures alone, but in thousands of unseen decisions to remain human in an inhuman age. This is the true revelation. Not that evil exists that has never been in doubt, but that it does not get the final word. Meaning does, love does, truth does. And those who align themselves with these realities find, often to their surprise, that they are no longer merely surviving history, but shaping it quietly, faithfully, and with a strength no darkness has yet learned how to defeat. And shaping history in this way rarely feels heroic while it is happening. More often it feels ordinary, even unnoticed. The quiet refusal to lie on a tax form, the decision to step away from an opportunity that demands the sacrifice of one's conscience, the patience to listen when anger would be more satisfying, the courage to give when fear insists on scarcity. These moments do not trend, they do not gather applause, and yet they form the moral infrastructure upon which civilizations either rise or rot. This is why every age that loses its way begins by mocking virtue as weakness and restraint as irrelevance. It teaches people to admire cleverness over wisdom, speed over depth, acquisition over contribution. It whispers that the good life is the easy life, that struggle is a sign of failure rather than formation. But the soul knows better, even when the mind pretends otherwise. The soul remembers that the most meaningful joys are purchased not with money, but with endurance, honesty, and love that costs something. Consider how subtly the heart can be trained to accept what it once resisted. A small compromise today becomes a habit tomorrow and a philosophy the next year. Not because the person set out to betray their values, but because they postponed obedience in the name of convenience. This is how corruption works most effectively, not through dramatic rebellion, but through delay. Tomorrow, it says. Later, when things are easier, when you are safer, when you have more leverage. And by the time tomorrow arrives, The soul has already learned to live without courage. Yet repentance, in its truest sense, is not self-loathing or theatrical regret. It is reorientation, a turning of the whole self back toward what is real. It begins not with shame, but with clarity, with the recognition that something precious has been misplaced, and the decision to retrieve it, no matter the cost. This retrieval is rarely instantaneous. It is a slow reordering of loves, placing truth above comfort, meaning above money, faithfulness above applause. Here, discipline re-enters the story, not as punishment, but as freedom's ally. Discipline is what allows desire to mature rather than dominate. It trains the will to serve the good even when the feelings protest. Without discipline, freedom dissolves into impulse. With it, freedom becomes the capacity to choose what one will not regret. This is why the soul that learns discipline discovers a strange paradox. Limits, rightly chosen, do not imprison, they protect, and gratitude, practiced daily, seals this protection. Gratitude dismantles the illusion that life owes us something beyond the gift it already is. It breaks the spell of entitlement that fuels so much modern despair. When gratitude is absent, even abundance feels insufficient. When gratitude is present, scarcity loses its terror. Gratitude does not deny hardship. It contextualizes it. It reminds the soul that pain is a chapter, not the whole story. This is where the language of victory becomes meaningful rather than hollow. To say that the battle is already won is not to deny struggle, but to anchor struggle in hope. It is to understand that evil's greatest weapon, despair, has been disarmed. One may be wounded, tired, uncertain, but one is not abandoned. One fights not to earn worth, but because worth has already been bestowed. Such understanding produces a distinct kind of courage, not the reckless courage that seeks danger for its own sake, but the steady courage that remains when danger arrives uninvited. It is the courage to stand without theatrics, to speak without cruelty, to act without guarantees. It does not need to shout about darkness, because it has learned how to walk in light. And light, contrary to popular imagination, is not always bright. Sometimes it is quiet, sometimes it flickers, sometimes it exists only as a refusal to extinguish, but even the smallest light changes the nature of the space it inhabits. Darkness cannot negotiate with it. Darkness can only retreat or remain exposed. This is why no secret system, no hidden influence, no generational pattern ultimately holds the final authority over a life that chooses alignment with truth. Patterns can be interrupted, inheritances can be redeemed, futures can diverge sharply from pasts, not through spectacle, but through perseverance, not through obsession with evil, but through devotion to good. And so the real question confronting every listener is not whether shadowy forces exist, but whether you will allow your inner life to be governed by fear or by faithfulness, whether you will spend your energy hunting conspiracies or cultivating character, whether you will measure success by accumulation or by contribution, whether, when the moment comes, as it always does, you will choose what is easy or what is right. For in that choice, repeated quietly over a lifetime, the soul is either diminished or enlarged. And an enlarged soul awake, disciplined, grateful, and anchored in meaning becomes something the world can neither fully understand nor easily control. It becomes, in the deepest sense, free. And freedom, once tasted, does not need secret orders, hidden power, or worldly dominance. It needs only courage enough to remain itself in a world that constantly asks it to be something else. And remaining oneself in such a world is perhaps the most radical act left to us. Not the loud rebellion of slogans and banners, but the quiet fidelity to truth when distortion would be rewarded. To live without a divided soul, to let one's inner convictions and outer conduct face each other without flinching, this is the work that exhausts false powers more thoroughly than any expose ever could. For deception survives only where people consent to live at odds with themselves. There is a peculiar sadness in watching a person who has everything they once wanted yet cannot explain why they feel hollow. They chased security and found anxiety. They chased recognition and found loneliness. They chased wealth and discovered that money is remarkably poor company in the middle of the night. This sadness is not a punishment. It is a signal, a mercy even. It is the soul's way of saying that it was made for something sturdier than accumulation, something deeper than applause. Meaning, when finally embraced, does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It grows like a muscle, strengthened through repeated use. Each time one chooses honesty over advantage, the muscle strengthens. Each time one gives without calculating return, it strengthens. Each time one resists the urge to appear impressive and chooses instead to be faithful, it strengthens. Over time, this strength becomes character, and character becomes a kind of wealth that cannot be inflated away or stolen by circumstance. This is why fear-based spirituality ultimately collapses. Fear may motivate compliance, but it cannot sustain love. It may produce conformity, but never transformation. A faith built primarily on anxiety will either harden into cruelty or dissolve into exhaustion. Only love, costly, inconvenient, disciplined love, has the endurance to outlast darkness. And love, paradoxically, is the one force that secret systems cannot counterfeit. They can imitate power, they can imitate unity, they can even imitate sacrifice, but they cannot imitate love without surrendering the very control they seek to maintain. To live from victory, then, is to refuse the lie that the world is held together by manipulation. It is to believe, stubbornly and against appearances, that truth remains more resilient than deceit, generosity more potent than greed, humility more enduring than pride. This belief is not sentimental, it is practical. It shapes how one spends money, how one uses influence, how one speaks to those with less power, and how one treats those who cannot repay. And here the circle closes, returning us to the heart of abundance. Abundance is not the multiplication of possessions, but the expansion of capacity, the capacity to endure hardship without becoming bitter, to succeed without becoming arrogant, to give without becoming resentful, to lose without losing oneself. This abundance does not depend on markets or moods. It depends on alignment, on living in agreement with what is true, even when truth is inconvenient. The world will continue to offer its shortcuts, its secret paths to influence without integrity, its promises of safety without sacrifice. It always has, but those paths inevitably demand a toll paid in fragments of the soul. And the soul, once fragmented, becomes easier to manage, easier to distract, easier to exploit. Wholeness, by contrast, is stubborn. It resists ownership. It answers to a higher allegiance. So the invitation stands, quietly but insistently. Choose wholeness. Choose the slow work of becoming the kind of person who cannot be easily bought, frightened, or deceived. Choose to handle wealth as a steward rather than a servant. Choose to see faith not as an escape from reality, but as the courage to face it fully. Choose to remember, again and again, what you are for. In making these choices, you will not feel powerful in the way the world defines power. You may feel exposed, you may feel smaller, you may even feel as though you are losing. But something else will be happening beneath the surface. Your life will be acquiring weight, substance, authority of a quieter, more dangerous kind, the kind that does not need permission to exist. And in that authority, the noise of dark influences fades, not because they are gone, but because they are no longer central. They shrink to their true size, revealed as parasitic rather than sovereign. The soul, no longer fascinated by shadows, turns its attention to the work of living, loving, building, forgiving, persevering. This is the awakening that no conspiracy can prevent. The moment a person realizes that they are not here merely to survive the age, but to answer it, not with panic, but with presence, not with fear, but with faithfulness, not with domination, but with depth. And when enough lives answer in this way, history bends, not abruptly, not spectacularly, but decisively. For it has always been shaped, in the end, not by secret orders, but by ordinary people who refused to let darkness define the terms of their existence, and who discovered, often too late to impress the world, but just in time to save their souls, that the truest power had been within their reach all along.